My church forced me to claim I stole money the pastor embezzled. Pastor Gregory Whitmore slid the paper across his mahogany desk and told me to sign it. The confession letter said I stole $43,000 from Grace Community Church's building fund over 8 months. I was 22 years old and had been the church bookkeeper for 14 months. I'd never stolen anything in my life. Gregory leaned back in his leather chair and folded his hands over his stomach. He said if I didn't sign, he'd make sure my younger brother Daniel lost his scholarship to the Christian Academy attached to our church. Daniel was 16 and brilliant, studying there on full academic scholarship worth $30,000 a year. Gregory said one phone call to the board and Daniel would be expelled for having a thief in the family. My parents had sacrificed everything to get Daniel into that school. Dad worked double shifts at the factory and Mom cleaned houses 6 days a week. The scholarship was Daniel's only shot at a real education. I picked up the pen and asked Gregory why he was doing this. He smiled and said the church board had questions about missing funds and someone needed to take responsibility. He said I was young and single with no real commitments, so this wouldn't hurt me as much as it would hurt him. He had a wife, 3 kids, a mortgage, and 20 years of ministry at Grace Community. I put the pen down and told him I wouldn't sign. His smile disappeared, and he stood up from his chair. Gregory walked to his office window that overlooked the church parking lot. He said he'd already planted evidence in my apartment. Bank statements showing deposits that matched the stolen amounts, withdrawal slips with my signature forged, receipts for expensive items I supposedly bought with church money. He said he'd been planning this for 3 months, ever since the denomination's financial auditors announced a surprise review of all churches in our region. The audit was scheduled for 6 weeks from now. Gregory turned around and his face looked different than I'd ever seen it. Cold and calculating instead of warm and pastoral. He said I had 2 choices: sign the confession and quietly resign, or refuse and watch him destroy my entire family. He'd make sure Daniel got expelled. He'd tell the church board that my father had been stealing tools from the factory, something he could easily fabricate evidence for. He'd spread rumors about my mother's cleaning business, suggest she'd been stealing from the wealthy families she worked for. He said this town was small, and Grace Community Church had influence everywhere. The factory owner attended our church. The school superintendent attended our church. The police chief attended our church. Gregory sat back down and asked me who I thought people would believe: a respected pastor with 2 decades of ministry, or a 22-year-old bookkeeper barely out of community college. I signed the paper because I couldn't let my family suffer for whatever Gregory had done. My hands shook so badly that my signature looked nothing like normal. Gregory took the confession and locked it in his desk drawer. He said I'd resign on Sunday during the morning service and read a shorter version of the confession to the congregation. He'd already written my resignation speech. I had to memorize it and deliver it with appropriate remorse. He said if I deviated from the script or tried to implicate him, he'd release all the fabricated evidence and press charges. I'd go to jail, and my family would still be ruined. I asked him what he'd actually done with the money. Gregory told me that wasn't my concern anymore. He handed me the resignation speech, 3 paragraphs about my gambling addiction and how I'd stolen from God's house to fund my sin. I'd never gambled in my life, never even bought a lottery ticket, but I read the speech and memorized every word because I had no choice. Gregory told me to go home and practice in front of a mirror until I looked genuinely repentant. He said my performance on Sunday needed to be convincing or the deal was off. I left his office feeling like I'd signed away my entire future. My mom called that night asking if I was coming to dinner on Thursday. Thursday was family night at my parents' house, something we'd done since I was a kid. I told her I wasn't feeling well and would skip this week. She asked if everything was okay, and I lied and said work was stressful. She said she'd pray for me, and Daniel wanted to show me his science project. I told her I'd come by over the weekend and got off the phone before she could hear my voice break. I sat in my apartment staring at the resignation speech Gregory had written. The words made me sound pathetic and weak, made it seem like I'd betrayed everyone who trusted me because I couldn't control my urges. The speech included an apology to the congregation for disappointing them and a promise to seek professional help for my addiction. Gregory had thought of everything. He'd even included a line about how ashamed I was to face my family after what I'd done. I read it over and over until the words blurred together. My phone buzzed with a text from my friend Lucas, asking if I wanted to grab coffee. Lucas attended Grace Community and worked at the credit union downtown. I ignored the text because I didn't know how to face anyone yet. Sunday morning arrived too fast. I got to church early and sat in Gregory's office going over the speech one more time. He came in wearing his best suit and carrying his sermon notes. He looked completely calm, like this was just another regular Sunday. He asked if I was ready, and I nodded. He reminded me about the fabricated evidence and what would happen to my family if I didn't follow through. The morning service started at 10. I sat in the back row instead of my usual seat near the front with my parents and Daniel. I watched Gregory lead worship and deliver announcements and pray over the offering. He was charismatic and confident, making jokes that got the congregation laughing. People loved him. He'd been their pastor since before I was born. He'd performed weddings and baptisms and funerals for half the families in that sanctuary. When he preached, people leaned forward in their seats, hanging on every word. That morning, he preached about integrity and being faithful in small things before God trusts you with bigger things. The irony made my stomach turn. After his sermon, he called me up to the platform and said I had something important to share with the church family. I walked to the front and stood behind the podium. 300 faces stared at me, waiting to hear what I had to say. My parents sat 5 rows back, looking confused. Daniel sat beside them with his church notebook open, ready to take notes during the service like he always did. I saw Lucas near the middle section. Saw Mrs. Patricia Drummond, who taught my Sunday school class when I was 8. Saw the Carlson family who'd hired me to help with their tax preparation last year because they trusted me with their financial information. Saw elderly Mr. Bernard Foster who'd mentored me through confirmation classes and told me I had a gift for numbers and should use it to serve the church. I pulled out the resignation speech and started reading. My voice came out steady, even though everything inside me was screaming. I confessed to stealing $43,000 from the building fund, admitted to having a gambling problem I'd hidden from everyone, apologized for betraying the trust of the congregation and bringing shame to God's house. The sanctuary was completely silent. I could hear people breathing. My mother made a small sound, something between a gasp and a sob. I kept reading. Said I was resigning effective immediately and seeking help for my addiction. Said I understood if the church wanted to press charges, and I would accept whatever consequences came. Gregory stood beside me with his hand on my shoulder, playing the role of the compassionate pastor supporting a fallen member of his flock. When I finished, Gregory prayed over me. He prayed for my healing and restoration. He prayed that God would use this difficult season to transform my life. He prayed that the congregation would show grace and forgiveness while also maintaining appropriate boundaries. He made it sound like he was heartbroken over my failure, but committed to my spiritual recovery. People in the congregation started crying. Someone said amen. Mrs. Drummond had her hand over her mouth, looking devastated. My father's face had gone completely white. Daniel just stared at me with an expression I couldn't read. Gregory finished praying and dismissed me from the platform. I walked out of the sanctuary and didn't stop until I reached my car in the parking lot. My phone started buzzing immediately with calls and texts. I turned it off and drove home. That afternoon, the church treasurer, Raymond Vance, called my landline and asked me to return my office key and church credit card. He said the board had voted to pursue criminal charges. I told him I'd drop everything off tomorrow. He hung up without saying goodbye. Raymond had been friendly with me since I started working at the church. He'd bought me lunch on my first day and told me he was glad to have someone competent handling the books. Now his voice was cold and formal, all warmth gone. My parents showed up at my apartment that evening. Dad didn't say anything, just stood in my doorway looking at me with this expression of complete bewilderment. Mom kept asking why I didn't come to them if I needed money. She said they could have helped, could have gotten me into counseling, could have done something to prevent this. I wanted to tell them the truth, but I could hear Gregory's voice in my head threatening Daniel's scholarship. So I said I was ashamed and didn't want them to know. I said the gambling started small, but got out of control, and I made terrible choices. My mother cried and asked where her son had gone. Who was this person standing in front of her because I wasn't the boy she'd raised? Dad finally spoke and said Daniel couldn't know about this. He said Daniel looked up to me, and this would destroy him. I said Daniel was at church, so he already knew. Dad's face did something complicated, and he turned and walked out of my apartment. Mom stayed for another minute. She hugged me and said she loved me even though she didn't understand what I'd done. Then she left too. I sat on my couch in the empty apartment and realized Gregory had successfully isolated me from everyone I cared about. The confession made me look like a liar and an addict. Anything I said now would sound like excuses from someone trying to avoid responsibility. The church board met 2 days later and formally terminated my employment. They sent a certified letter outlining their decision and informing me that they'd filed a police report. Detective Cameron Wright called that afternoon and asked me to come to the station for questioning. I went in the next morning and sat across from him in a small interview room. He asked me to walk through how I'd stolen the money. I repeated the story from my confession because I didn't know what else to do. He took notes and asked specific questions about dates and amounts. Then, he showed me bank statements from an account I'd never seen before. The account was in my name and showed regular deposits over 8 months totaling $43,000. Deposits made on dates that matched withdrawals from the church building fund. I told Detective Wright I'd never opened that account and didn't know it existed. He asked if someone had stolen my identity, and I said yes, exactly that. He looked at me with an expression that said he'd heard every excuse before. He asked why I'd confessed to the congregation if I hadn't actually stolen anything. I couldn't tell him about Gregory's threats without proof, couldn't accuse a respected pastor of embezzlement and framing me without evidence. So I said I panicked and made a mistake. He wrote that down and said I should get a lawyer. I couldn't afford a real lawyer, so I went to legal aid. They assigned me to an overworked public defender named Veronica Nash, who had about 15 minutes to discuss my case. She reviewed the police report and the bank statements and asked if I actually stole the money. I said no. She asked why I confessed, and I told her about Gregory's threats. She said that would be hard to prove, and without evidence, it was my word against a pastor's. She said the bank statements were damning, and the confession letter made everything worse. She asked if I had any proof that Gregory fabricated the evidence. I didn't. She said my best option was probably to plead guilty and hope for a reduced sentence since this was my first offense. I asked her about fighting the charges, and she said we could try, but the prosecution had a strong case. She said confessions were powerful evidence, and juries tended to believe people who admitted to crimes. I left her office feeling trapped. Gregory had planned everything perfectly. The fake bank account, the forged documents, the forced confession. He'd made it impossible for me to defend myself without looking like I was lying to avoid consequences. I started going through my old work files looking for anything that might prove Gregory's guilt. I'd kept copies of financial reports and reconciliation statements from my time as bookkeeper. I spent 3 days reviewing every document looking for irregularities. On the 4th day, I found something. A transfer from the building fund to an account I didn't recognize. The transfer was for $8,000 and dated 7 months ago. I'd noted it in my monthly report to the board, but labeled it as authorized by Pastor Whitmore for ministry expenses. I'd asked Gregory about it at the time, and he said it was for a mission trip. But looking at it now, I couldn't find any corresponding ministry expense reports or receipts. I checked the next month's records and found another transfer for $6,000, again authorized by Gregory, again with no supporting documentation. I went through every month I'd worked as bookkeeper and found transfers in 6 out of 14 months, totaling $29,000, all authorized by Gregory, all lacking proper documentation. The remaining $14,000 from the missing $43,000 must have been taken before I started working there, or through a method I hadn't tracked. This wasn't proof that Gregory had stolen the money, but it was proof that unauthorized transfers had happened under his authority. I called Veronica and told her what I'd found. She said it was interesting but circumstantial. Without proof that Gregory personally received the money, it just showed poor financial oversight. She said I needed to find the actual accounts where the money went. I needed bank statements showing Gregory's name, deposit slips, something concrete. I told her I didn't have access to church financial systems anymore. She said that was a problem. I asked about subpoenaing church records, and she said we'd need a judge to approve that, and judges didn't usually grant subpoenas based on speculation from defendants trying to blame someone else. I hung up feeling frustrated, but not defeated. I knew what I'd seen. Those transfers were suspicious, and they'd happened on Gregory's authorization. If I could trace where that money went, I could prove he'd stolen it. I just needed access to bank records I didn't have. Then I remembered Lucas worked at the credit union. Grace Community Church banked at First Valley Credit Union downtown, the same place Lucas worked as a loan officer. I called him and asked if we could meet for lunch. He said yes, but his voice was cautious. Everyone at church knew what I'd supposedly done. Lucas met me at a diner far from the church and our usual spots. He sat across from me and said he didn't have long because he had an appointment at 1:30. I told him I didn't steal the money. He stirred his coffee and didn't respond. I said I knew how it looked, but I needed him to trust me. He asked why I confessed if I didn't do it. I told him about Gregory's threats and the fabricated evidence. He listened without interrupting. When I finished, he said that was serious. If it was true, it was fraud and conspiracy and about 10 other crimes. I asked if he believed me. He said he'd known me since we were 14 and I'd never lied to him about anything important. He said the confession didn't match who I was as a person, but evidence was evidence. I told him about the unauthorized transfers I'd found. He leaned back in his seat and asked what I needed from him. I said I needed to know where those transfers went. If they went to accounts belonging to Gregory, that would prove he'd stolen the money and framed me. Lucas said he couldn't access individual account information without proper authorization. Bank privacy laws were strict, and he'd lose his job and possibly face criminal charges for unauthorized access. I said I understood. We finished lunch, and he paid the bill and told me he'd think about it. 3 days later, Lucas called and said he'd looked into the transfers. His voice was quiet and tense. He said 2 of the transfers went to an account belonging to something called Whitmore Family Trust, Gregory's last name. Lucas said he couldn't tell me more than that without violating bank policy, but that information should be enough for me to investigate further. I asked if he could get me actual statements or proof. He said no, he'd already risked too much just confirming the account name. He said I should take what I'd learned to my lawyer and let the legal system handle it. I thanked him, and he said to be careful. He said Gregory had a lot of influence in this town, and people who went against him tended to have bad things happen. I didn't ask what he meant by that. After we hung up, I called Veronica and told her about the Whitmore Family Trust. She said that was significant. If we could prove church funds went into Gregory's personal trust, that was clear evidence of embezzlement. She said she'd file a motion to subpoena bank records for that trust account. She warned me it might take weeks to get approved, and Gregory would be notified about the subpoena. He'd know I was fighting back. The subpoena request went before a judge 12 days later. Gregory showed up with a lawyer, an expensive-looking man in a tailored suit who'd driven up from the city. The lawyer argued that the subpoena was a fishing expedition by a defendant trying to deflect blame. He said I'd already confessed to the crime, and now I was trying to drag the pastor's name through the mud to avoid responsibility. He said the Whitmore Family Trust was a legitimate estate planning vehicle that had nothing to do with church finances. The judge looked skeptical, but said he'd review the motion and issue a ruling within a week. Veronica told me that was better than she'd expected. Judges usually denied these kinds of requests outright. The fact that he was considering it meant something in our argument had resonated. We walked out of the courthouse, and Gregory was standing by his car talking on his phone. He saw me and ended his call. He walked over and said this was my last chance to make things right. I could withdraw the subpoena request, accept a plea deal, and move on with my life. Or I could keep pushing, and he'd make sure I went to prison for a long time. He said he had friends in the district attorney's office who owed him favors. He could make my charges worse. I told him I wasn't afraid of him anymore. His jaw tightened, and he said I should be. The judge approved the subpoena 6 days later. Veronica called me at 7 in the morning sounding excited. She said the judge's order was narrow but sufficient. We could access bank records for the Whitmore Family Trust for the relevant time period. She said we'd have the documents within 2 weeks. I felt something like hope for the first time since signing that confession letter. Gregory called me that afternoon. He said I'd made a serious mistake going after him. He said he'd spoken to Daniel's school principal and expressed concerns about the quality of students they were accepting. He said one conversation with the scholarship committee, and Daniel would lose his spot. I told him if he touched my brother, I'd make sure everyone knew what he'd done. He laughed and said nobody would believe me. I was already a confessed thief. My credibility was destroyed. Anything I said now would sound like the desperate lies of a criminal trying to escape punishment. He hung up and I stood there holding my phone, realizing he was right. The confession had poisoned everything. Even if I had proof, people might not believe me because I'd already admitted guilt. I'd given Gregory the perfect shield against accusations. I went to see Daniel at the Christian Academy that evening. He was in the library studying when I found him. He looked up, and his expression was guarded. I sat down across from him and asked how he was doing. He said fine. I asked if anyone at school had been giving him trouble about me. He said some kids had made comments, but mostly people avoided talking about it. He closed his textbook and asked if I actually stole the money. I wanted to tell him everything, but I couldn't risk Gregory finding out. So I said things were complicated and not what they seemed. He asked what that meant, and I said I was working on fixing the situation. He asked if I was going to jail. I said I didn't know. He stood up and started packing his books. He said Mom cried every night, and Dad barely spoke anymore. He said I'd destroyed our family over gambling debts. I let him believe that because the alternative was worse. He left the library without saying goodbye. I sat there for a long time thinking about how Gregory had turned my own brother against me. The damage he'd done went beyond stolen money. He'd broken relationships and shattered trust and made me look like someone I wasn't. The bank records for the Whitmore Family Trust arrived 3 weeks later. Veronica called me to her office and spread the documents across her desk. The account showed 6 deposits over 8 months matching the dates and amounts of the unauthorized transfers from the church building fund. $29,000 total. Veronica said this proved Gregory had stolen church money. The transfers went directly from the building fund to his personal trust. I asked about the remaining $14,000 from the total $43,000. She said that must have been taken through a different method, possibly before I started working at the church. She said what we had was enough to prove Gregory committed embezzlement and probably conspiracy to commit fraud by framing me. She said we needed to take this to the district attorney immediately. I asked if she thought they'd believe us. She said the bank records didn't lie. This was concrete evidence that Gregory stole from the church and then forced me to take the blame. She said I should prepare for everything to move quickly now. Once the DA saw this evidence, they'd likely open an investigation into Gregory. We went to the district attorney's office the next morning. Assistant DA Kenneth Merrick met with us in a conference room. Veronica presented everything we'd found: the unauthorized transfers from my old bookkeeping records, the connection to the Whitmore Family Trust, the bank statements showing matching deposits. Kenneth reviewed the documents for 20 minutes without speaking. Finally, he said this changed things significantly. He said they'd been prepared to prosecute me based on my confession and the fabricated bank account. But this evidence suggested Pastor Whitmore had orchestrated the theft and framed me for it. He asked why I'd confessed if I didn't commit the crime. I told him about Gregory's threats against my brother's scholarship and my parents' reputations. I told him about the planted evidence and the forced resignation speech. Kenneth took notes and said he'd need to interview other potential witnesses. He'd need to verify the bank records and investigate the fake account that had been opened in my name. He said this would take time, but he was suspending prosecution against me pending the investigation. He said I couldn't leave town and needed to stay available for questioning. I agreed to everything. Grace Community Church exploded with gossip within 24 hours. Someone at the district attorney's office leaked that Gregory was under investigation for embezzlement. The church board called an emergency meeting. I heard about it from my mother, who'd heard about it from Mrs. Drummond. Mom called me crying and asking if what people were saying was true. Had Gregory really stolen the money and blamed me for it? I said yes. She said she was sorry for not believing me at first. She said she should have known I wouldn't steal from the church. I told her it was okay, that Gregory had been convincing. She said Dad wanted to talk to me but wasn't ready yet. She said Daniel had been asking questions about what was really happening. I told her to tell Daniel I loved him and I'd explain everything soon. After we hung up, I felt lighter than I had in months. The truth was finally coming out, and people were starting to question Gregory's version of events. The district attorney's investigation moved faster than I expected. Kenneth subpoenaed Gregory's personal financial records, his tax returns, his credit card statements. He interviewed church board members and staff. He brought in a forensic accountant to examine the church's books going back 3 years. Within 2 weeks, they'd found evidence of additional thefts beyond the $43,000 I'd been accused of stealing. Gregory had been embezzling from Grace Community Church for at least 5 years, possibly longer. The total amount exceeded $200,000. He'd taken money from multiple church accounts using various methods. Sometimes he authorized transfers to his family trust. Sometimes he wrote checks to fake vendors and cashed them himself. Sometimes he simply took cash from offering collections. He'd hidden it all by keeping the church board focused on other things and maintaining personal control over financial decisions. When I'd been hired as bookkeeper, I'd started asking questions about documentation and proper procedures. That's when Gregory realized he needed to shut down the investigation before the denomination's auditors arrived. He'd set me up perfectly, creating the fake account and planting evidence months in advance. Gregory was arrested on a Wednesday morning during the church staff meeting. Police walked into the conference room where he was meeting with the worship leader and youth pastor about summer programming. They read him his rights in front of his staff and walked him out in handcuffs. Someone took a video and posted it online. By that afternoon, the footage had spread through every social media platform. News stations picked up the story. Local pastor arrested for embezzling from his church. Respected community leader charged with fraud and conspiracy. The narrative shifted overnight. Suddenly, I wasn't the thief anymore. I was the victim, the young bookkeeper who'd been coerced into taking the fall for his boss's crimes. My phone started ringing with calls from church members apologizing. Mrs. Drummond came to my apartment with a casserole and tears streaming down her face. She said she was sorry for believing the worst about me. She said she should have known better. Mr. Foster called and said the church owed me a profound apology. He said the board had voted to issue a formal statement clearing my name and accepting responsibility for not protecting me. The church treasurer, Raymond Vance, showed up at my door and said he was ashamed. He said he should have asked more questions about the financial irregularities instead of accepting Gregory's explanations. The church board asked me to address the congregation on Sunday. They wanted me to tell my story and help the church community understand what had happened. I said I'd think about it. Part of me wanted to stand in front of everyone who judged me and make them face what they'd done. Part of me just wanted to walk away and never set foot in Grace Community Church again. I called Veronica and asked what she thought. She said it was my choice, but speaking publicly might help my healing process. She said I'd been forced into silence for months, and now I had a chance to use my voice. I decided to do it. Sunday morning, I arrived at the church early. The sanctuary was packed. People had heard I was coming and everyone wanted to be there. I saw my parents sitting in the second row with Daniel between them. I saw Lucas near the back. Saw faces I'd known my entire life, people who'd watched me grow up in this church. The interim pastor introduced me and said the church leadership wanted to give me an opportunity to share my experience. I walked to the podium and looked out at 300 people waiting to hear what I had to say. I told them everything. Started with Gregory sliding that confession letter across his desk and threatening my brother's scholarship. Described the fake bank account and planted evidence. Explained how I'd been forced to confess to a crime I didn't commit because I couldn't let my family be destroyed. Told them about the isolation and shame, about losing my job and my reputation, about being treated like a criminal by people I'd known since childhood. I told them about finding the unauthorized transfers and tracing the money to Gregory's family trust, about Lucas risking his job to help me, about Veronica fighting for a subpoena, about the district attorney's investigation uncovering years of theft. I spoke for 20 minutes, and the sanctuary stayed completely silent. When I finished, I said I forgave Gregory because that's what Christians were supposed to do. But forgiveness didn't mean forgetting what happened or pretending it was okay. I said the church needed to do better, needed to have systems in place so one person couldn't abuse power without accountability. I said I hoped my story would prevent this from happening to someone else. Then I walked off the platform and sat down next to my parents. My mother grabbed my hand and held it tight. Daniel leaned against my shoulder. The interim pastor stood up and led the congregation in a prayer of repentance. People were crying all over the sanctuary. After the service, dozens of people came up to apologize. Some of them cried while they hugged me. Some of them just shook my hand and said they were sorry. The experience was overwhelming and exhausting and strangely healing. I'd spent months feeling alone and judged. Now I was surrounded by people expressing genuine remorse for how they'd treated me. Not everyone apologized. Some families left the church permanently, unable to reconcile with what had happened under their watch. Some people still seemed uncomfortable around me, like they weren't sure what to say, but the majority of the congregation rallied with support. They started a fundraising campaign to help with my legal fees, even though the charges against me had been dropped. They offered to write letters to potential employers, explaining what had happened. They invited my family to dinners and events, trying to restore the relationships that had been damaged. Grace Community Church set up new financial accountability structures and hired an outside firm to audit their books quarterly. They created a whistleblower policy so staff could report concerns without fear of retaliation. They began training all volunteers and staff on recognizing signs of financial abuse and spiritual manipulation. Gregory's trial happened 8 months later. I testified about the forced confession and the threats he'd made. Lucas testified about the suspicious account activity he'd noticed. The forensic accountant testified about the pattern of theft spanning 5 years. Church board members testified about how Gregory had maintained control over financial decisions and discouraged questions. The jury deliberated for 6 hours and found him guilty on all counts: embezzlement, fraud, conspiracy, coercion, identity theft. The judge sentenced him to 12 years in federal prison and ordered him to pay full restitution to the church. His wife divorced him before sentencing. His kids stopped using his last name. Everything he'd tried to protect by framing me fell apart anyway. His reputation was destroyed far worse than mine had ever been. His career was over. His family was broken. The community that had once admired him now viewed him with contempt and anger. I sat in the courtroom during sentencing and felt no satisfaction, just sadness that it had come to this. Gregory had thrown away 20 years of ministry and hurt countless people because he couldn't admit to his mistakes and ask for help. He'd chosen pride and self-preservation over integrity and ended up losing everything. I finished my accounting degree at a state university 2 hours away and got hired by a nonprofit that worked with churches on financial management and accountability. My job was to help religious organizations set up systems that prevented the kind of abuse I'd experienced. I trained church boards on proper oversight, taught bookkeepers what red flags to watch for, and developed policies that protected both congregations and staff. The work felt meaningful because I was using my worst experience to help other people avoid similar situations. Daniel graduated from the Christian Academy with honors and got a full scholarship to a prestigious university. He told me years later that watching me fight for the truth had taught him more about integrity than anything he'd learned in school. My parents started attending a different church, but maintained friendships with people from Grace Community. Our family relationships healed slowly, conversation by conversation, as trust was rebuilt. Lucas got promoted to branch manager at the credit union and still called me every few weeks to check in. We'd grab coffee and talk about ordinary things, never dwelling on the past, but acknowledging how it had shaped us both. Grace Community Church thrived under new leadership, becoming a model for financial transparency and healthy power structures. They invited me back to speak at their annual meeting about creating cultures of accountability. And I went because I wanted to celebrate how far they'd come. 3 years after Gregory's arrest, I stood in that same sanctuary where I'd been forced to confess to crimes I didn't commit. And this time I spoke about redemption and restoration and the possibility of institutions learning from their failures. The congregation listened differently now, with humility and awareness, understanding that vigilance and honesty were ongoing commitments, not one-time achievements. If you enjoyed this, you'll definitely want to see the next ones too. So subscribe now and let me know your take in the comments.